The boardroom on the 32nd floor of Callaway Tower had a view that could make you forget what you'd just done to someone. Sylvia Brennan knew this because she'd stood at that window before. After difficult quarters, after restructurings that looked clean on paper, after conversations she'd replayed in her mind on the drive home, when the city lights blurred through the rain and she told herself it was necessary. It was business. It was the only way. She was standing there again now. Behind her, the chair was still pulled back from the table where Nathan Gould had been sitting 20 minutes ago. His coffee cup was still there too, still half full, which for some reason was the detail she couldn't stop thinking about. He hadn't touched it after she'd walked in. He'd seen her face and known immediately, and he hadn't touched the coffee. "Mrs. Brennan." Her assistant's voice came through the intercom, careful and neutral in the way Priya had learned to be when she sensed the temperature in the room. "Your 2 o'clock is confirmed. Push it 30 minutes. A pause. "Of course." Sylvia turned from the window and looked at the chair again. Then she picked up Nathan's coffee cup herself, carried it to the credenza, and set it down next to the others. She hadn't planned to fire Nathan Gould this morning. She'd planned to review the Whitmore acquisition files, attend a preliminary call with the Calgary team, and have lunch at her desk. But the operations report had landed in her inbox at 7:45, and the discrepancy in the Gould file had been right there on page 11, and by 9 o'clock she'd already called legal, and by 10:15 she'd already made up her mind. That was how Sylvia worked. She decided quickly. She acted on what she decided. She didn't linger. Nathan had been with Meridian Capital for 11 years. She'd known that going in. She'd told herself it didn't change the math. What she hadn't known, what she found out only afterward, when she was back at her desk and Priya had come in quietly and set a thin folder on the corner of her desk without saying anything, was that Nathan's wife had left 8 months ago, that he was raising his daughter alone, that he'd been arriving at work 40 minutes late every single morning because he drove Clara to school himself, refused to put her on the bus, and the school didn't open its doors until 8:15. Sylvia had read the folder twice. Then she'd set it face down on her desk and told herself it still didn't change the math. Nathan Gould had been driving the same route for 8 months. Left on Dunbar, right on 41st, straight through to Kerrisdale Elementary, where he'd sit in the drop-off line with his hazards on and watch Clara walk up the front steps and wave at him from the door before she went inside. She always waited until she could see him wave back. That was the deal they'd made. It had started the week after Renee left. Clara was 7. She'd stood at the kitchen window that first morning, backpack on, lunch bag in hand, watching the driveway, and Nathan had understood immediately what she was watching for. He'd put on his coat and picked up his keys and said, "Come on, I'll take you." He hadn't stopped since. The 40 minutes it cost him at work were 40 minutes he'd been trying to make up in other ways. Staying later, eating at his desk, taking calls on weekends, he'd thought it was working. He'd thought no one had noticed, or that if they had, they'd understood. He understood now that he'd been wrong. He drove away from Meridian Capital at 10:43 in the morning on a Tuesday in March, and the city looked exactly the same as it always did, which felt wrong somehow. The rain was light and indifferent. The traffic on Burrard moved the way it always moved. There was a food cart on the corner of Georgia that he'd never noticed before, a man in a yellow jacket selling coffee, and Nathan found himself staring at it for the length of a red light, thinking about nothing in particular. He'd have to tell Clara something tonight. Not everything. She was 8 years old and she didn't need to carry this. But something, because she was perceptive in ways that consistently startled him, and she'd know by dinner that something was wrong. She always knew. He turned east and drove without a clear destination, which was unusual for him. Nathan was a man who liked a plan, who kept a legal pad on his nightstand for the thoughts that came at 2 in the morning, who had color-coded the recycling bins in his kitchen, even though it was just the 2 of them, and the system was arguably overkill. He didn't do well with open-endedness. But he drove east anyway, out toward Commercial, because the alternative was going home to his apartment and sitting in it, and he wasn't ready for that yet. He found a parking spot on Venables he didn't have to parallel into, which felt like a small mercy, and he sat in the car with the engine off and the rain ticking on the roof. His phone had 3 notifications. He ignored all of them. After a while, he got out and started walking. The playground at McLean Park was mostly empty at 11 in the morning on a Tuesday. There was a woman with a stroller parked near the bench by the climbing structure, and a man walking a very old golden retriever along the fence, and 2 kids who looked too young to be in school, preschool age. Maybe running in no particular direction while a tired-looking man in a parka watched them from the picnic table. Nathan walked the path around the perimeter of the park the way he sometimes did with Clara on weekend mornings, hands in his pockets, watching his breath. The rain had picked up a little. He didn't bother with his hood. He heard the screech of tires before he saw anything. The sound came from the street on the north side of the park, and Nathan turned toward it instinctively, and what he saw took him a second to process. A girl, maybe 9 or 10 years old, was standing frozen at the edge of the crosswalk at the intersection of Venables and Clark, her backpack straps in her hands, staring at the car that had come to a stop less than 2 meters from her. The driver had swerved and stopped. The girl hadn't moved. Nathan was already moving. He crossed the park at a run, pushed through the gate and the fence, and reached her in maybe 15 seconds. She was still standing in the same spot, the car idling, the driver's window rolling down. Nathan reached her first. "Hey." He kept his voice even. He crouched to her level. "Hey, look at me. You okay?" She turned her head. Her eyes were wide, and her face was a color he recognized from the one time Clara had come off her bike and hit the pavement. She was okay. She was scared, but she was okay. "I'm okay," she said, and her voice was steadier than he expected. "Good." He stood and looked at the driver, an older man, shaken, already saying he hadn't seen her, and Nathan raised a hand to let him know it was all right. They were all right, and the man sat there another moment before carefully pulling away. Nathan turned back to the girl. "You came out of nowhere on that crosswalk. The light wasn't for pedestrians yet." She looked at the signal, which was still showing the red hand. "I thought it had changed." It hadn't. He glanced around for a parent, a teacher, someone. "Are you by yourself? I'm supposed to meet my mom." She pointed vaguely east. "She parks on Clark on Tuesdays because there's no parking on Venables. I know the way, okay." He looked at her. She was wearing a school uniform, the kind with the navy blazer, and her hair was in 2 braids that were coming partially undone, and she had a bruise on her knee that was old enough to be yellow at the edges. "What's your name?" "Phoebe." "I'm Nathan." "How old are you, Phoebe?" 9. She glanced up at him with a directness that reminded him very sharply of Clara. "I really am okay, I know." He straightened. "I'll walk with you to your mom's car." She looked like she might argue, then didn't. They walked north on Clark together, and Nathan kept to the outside of the sidewalk, away from traffic, without making it obvious he was doing it. The silver Audi was parked halfway up the block. He could see a woman getting out of it before they reached the corner, and he could see by the way she moved, fast, slightly off balance, keys still in hand, that she'd been watching. Sylvia had been sitting in her car for 12 minutes. She did this on Tuesdays. She left the office at 10:30, drove to Clark Street, parked and waited. Phoebe's school ran a Tuesday enrichment program that ended at 11 and let out 2 blocks away, and since Phoebe was 9 and increasingly insistent about the fact that she was 9 and not a baby, Sylvia had agreed to the compromise. Sylvia would park, Phoebe would walk, and they would meet at the car. It was a 2-block walk on a residential street. Sylvia had surveyed it in advance. She'd done it in her own shoes and then again more slowly to account for Phoebe's pace. She'd told herself it was reasonable. She had not apparently accounted for the intersection at Venables. She was out of the car and moving before she'd quite registered what she'd seen through the windshield, the screech, the freeze, the man who'd appeared from nowhere and reached Phoebe before Sylvia had even gotten the door fully open. By the time she reached them at the corner, they were already walking calmly toward her, Phoebe chattering about something, the man listening with his hands in his pockets. Sylvia reached Phoebe first and put both hands on her shoulders and said her name, and Phoebe said, "Mom." "I'm fine," in the patient tone she reserved for moments when she decided that the adult was overreacting. Sylvia looked up at the man. He was tall, mid-30s maybe, in a jacket that wasn't quite warm enough for March. He had the slightly hollowed-out look of someone who'd had a hard morning. He was already stepping back, already making the small movements that communicated "I'm going now," giving her the space. "She walked into the intersection before the pedestrian signal," he said. "The car stopped in time. She's not hurt." He paused. "Just a scare." Sylvia's hands were still on Phoebe's shoulders. "Thank you." The words came out carefully. "Thank you. Were you nearby?" "I was in the park." He gestured vaguely behind him. Just walking," she repeated. Something about his face made her slow down. She was good at faces. It was one of the things she was genuinely good at, reading the small signals that people didn't know they were broadcasting. This man's face was doing something complicated. Not distressed, exactly. More like someone who'd been holding something at a distance and was now too tired to keep holding it. "Are you all right?" she asked. He looked mildly startled, as though he hadn't expected the question to come his direction. "I'm fine, Mom," Phoebe said, looking between them. He ran across the whole park. He was really fast. She considered this. For someone tall. The man looked down at Phoebe, and something in his expression shifted, a slight softening that happened quickly, almost before Sylvia could catch it. "Glad I could help," he said. "I want to get you something," Sylvia said. "A coffee. There's a place on Commercial. It's 5 minutes." She heard herself and tried to recalibrate. "Or your information. I'd like to write a letter, or that's not necessary." He wasn't rude about it, just quiet. Phoebe had been watching this exchange with the particular focus of a child who can tell when something is being communicated in a register she can't quite read. "What's your name?" she asked him. He glanced at Sylvia, then back at Phoebe. "Nathan. Nathan saved you," Phoebe said to her mother, as though this were a straightforward fact that needed to be on record. "He ran from all the way over there." "I know," Sylvia said. "Then we should get him coffee." Phoebe looked at Nathan. "My mom gets espresso. You can get whatever you want. She has money." Nathan made a sound that might have been a laugh. Sylvia's chest did something unexpected. "Phoebe," she said. "She's right," Nathan said, and then seemed slightly surprised that he'd said it. He recovered. "I'll take the coffee, if the offer is still open." The cafe on Commercial was called Tidewater and had no seating left, so they took their drinks to the covered bench outside, and Phoebe sat between them eating a shortbread cookie that Sylvia had bought before she could think better of it, and for a few minutes no one said much. The rain had eased. A streetcar went by. Nathan held his paper cup with both hands and looked at the street, and Sylvia looked at her phone and then put it face down on the bench, which was something she rarely did before 5 o'clock. "What do you do?" she asked. It came out more directly than she'd meant. "I work at Meridian Capital. A beat. Worked. I was let go this morning." Phoebe looked up timing. She said. "Phoebe," Sylvia said. "No, she's right." Nathan drank his coffee. Spectacular timing. Sylvia was looking at him now with a different kind of attention. "Meridian Capital," she said. "On Burrard?" "Yes." She set her cup down on the bench beside her. Her voice was very carefully flat when she said, "In what department?" He looked at her. "Operations, why?" The noise of the street continued. The streetcar was gone. Phoebe took another bite of her shortbread. Sylvia said, "What's your last name?" He said, "Gould." He said it the way people say things when they're already in the process of putting something together, when the pieces are arriving in the wrong order. He said it, and then he went still. Sylvia Brennan, whose company was Meridian Capital, whose name was on the letter Nathan had signed that morning, who had decided not to be moved by the folder Priya had left on her desk. Sylvia said nothing for a long moment. It was Phoebe who spoke. "Do you know each other?" she asked. Nathan stood up. He wasn't angry, which was almost harder to deal with than anger would have been. He was quiet, and his face had gone carefully blank, and he picked up his cup and looked for somewhere to throw it and then held on to it because there was no bin in reach. "Mr. Gould," Sylvia said. "I should go. Please don't." She said it plainly. No boardroom inflection. No "the decision has been made" cadence. Just the plain words. He stopped. Phoebe was looking between them with enormous eyes. "What's happening?" she asked. "Go look at the bookshop window," Sylvia said. "The one next door. Tell me what the window display is." Phoebe recognized a dismissal when she heard one, but she went, casting one long backward glance over her shoulder as she went. "Sit down," Sylvia said to Nathan. "I don't think, please." He sat not because she was his former employer, and not because he was obligated to, but because he was exhausted and the bench was there, and the request had been made without authority, which was something she didn't often allow herself. "Tell me about your daughter," she said. He looked at her. "The folder," she said. "I read it. I want you to tell me." He was quiet for a long moment. The rain came back lightly, and Phoebe could be seen through the bookshop window, pressing her nose to the glass, examining whatever was inside. "She's 8, he said. "Her name is Clara. Her mother left last March." He stopped, seemed to decide something, and continued. "She has a hard time with transitions, new situations. She needs consistency. The drop-off is 20 minutes out of my way if traffic is bad. I know it doesn't explain the full 40 minutes. I know what the clock said. What does she do?" Sylvia asked. "When you drop her off." He looked at her with something unguarded. "She waits at the door and waves every time, until I wave back." Sylvia said nothing. "I tried to make it up in other ways," Nathan said. "I know how it looks on paper. I know that you—" He paused. He seemed to be choosing words carefully, and not out of caution, but out of something more like precision. Like a man who had learned not to say more than was accurate. "I know that you were working with the information you had. I had more information than I used." He looked at her sharply. "The folder was on my desk before you left the building," she said. "I read it. I made a decision not to let it change my analysis." She said this the way she said hard things, directly, without the hedge of apology in front of it, because she'd learned that apology sometimes worked as camouflage for accountability. That was wrong. Nathan was quiet. It doesn't unsay what was said in that boardroom, she continued. I understand that. I'm not asking you to. Why are you telling me this? He asked. Because you ran across a park to reach my daughter, she said, and you didn't ask for anything. And you were going to leave without saying a word about it. She paused. And because I owe you honesty. I think you've been owed a lot of honesty today and gotten very little of it. He didn't argue with that. Phoebe came back from the bookshop window and reported that the display had a model train set and a stack of books about lighthouses and a stuffed owl that she thought was probably the best thing she'd seen this week. She looked at both adults. She seemed to assess, with the accuracy that had always slightly unnerved Sylvia, that things had shifted. She sat back down between them. Are you still fired? She asked Nathan. Nathan looked at Sylvia. That's complicated, Sylvia said. That means no, Phoebe said. She ate the last piece of her shortbread. It wasn't that simple, of course. It never was. What happened in the weeks after that Tuesday in March was not a single clean decision, but a series of smaller ones, which was actually how most things worked even when they got told as a single moment afterward. Sylvia Brennan drove home that afternoon with Phoebe in the back seat, and Phoebe fell asleep 10 minutes in, and Sylvia drove the rest of the way in the particular silence of a car with a sleeping child in it, and she thought about the folder on her desk and about the coffee cup she'd moved, and about the way Nathan had looked at Phoebe when she'd asked his name, that quick, unconscious softening. She called legal the following morning and told them to pause the separation paperwork. She called Nathan directly 2 days later. Not through Priya, not through HR. She called the number on his original application file, which she had no particular business having, but she was the CEO and she had access to the things she needed access to, and she needed this. He answered on the third ring. The conversation was short and uncomfortable and completely without ceremony, which was how she decided it had to be. She laid out what she was proposing, his position reinstated, with a formal schedule adjustment documented and approved, 30-minute flex window at morning arrival, no impact to performance review, reviewed at 6 months. She said it the way you said things that you'd already figured out and were not looking for debate on. He said, why are you doing this? She said, because I made the wrong call. He said, people don't generally come back from that. She said, no, they don't. There was a pause. He said, I'll need to think about it. She said, I know. And then before she could decide not to, how's Clara? Another pause, shorter. She's good. She has a history project about the Fraser River. She's very into it. Good, Sylvia said. She hung up and sat with her phone in her hands for a moment, and then she put it down and pulled the operations report back up on her screen and got back to work. Nathan thought about it for 4 days. He talked to no one, which was his way. He went through the grocery store and cooked Clara's dinners and helped her cut out photographs for the Fraser River project and lay them on a piece of poster board on the kitchen floor. And he thought about Meridian Capital and about Sylvia Brennan and about what it meant to go back. On the fourth night, Clara looked up from the poster board and said, Dad, are you worried about something? He said, a little. She looked at him. She had Renee's eyes but a mouth that was his, the kind that didn't hide things well. Is it about work? Yeah. She considered this with the gravity she brought to most things. Is it fixable? I think so. Then you should fix it, she said, and went back to the poster board. He called Sylvia the next morning. His first day back was a Thursday. He arrived at 7:45, before most of the floor, and sat at his desk in the quiet office and looked at the Calgary files that were still open in his inbox, and thought about the word necessary, and about the things you decided were necessary, and about the much smaller category of things that actually were. Priya appeared in the doorway of his office at 8:15 with coffee she'd made herself, not from the machine in the kitchen, but from the proper one on the 25th floor, and set it on his desk without comment. He understood that this was a communication of some kind and said thank you, and she nodded once and went back to her desk. Sylvia arrived at 9:02, which was 11 minutes earlier than her usual arrival, and she came past his office and stopped in the doorway for a moment, and he looked up. Good morning, Mr. Gould, she said. Good morning, Ms. Brennan, he said. She nodded and went to her office. It was not warm, exactly. It was not the beginning of an easy working relationship or the end of a difficult one. It was two people deciding to do the work, which was harder and also more durable than a clean resolution. There is a thing that happens sometimes, in the gap between the decision you made and the person you find out you needed to be. Sylvia had run a company for 7 years. She'd made cuts and restructures and hard calls, and she'd learned to make them cleanly and move on, and this had been treated by herself and others as a kind of discipline. The ability not to linger. She sat in her office in the late afternoon of Nathan's first Thursday back, and she thought about discipline and what it was actually for. whether the not lingering was about the company or about herself. Whether she'd spent years being efficient when what she'd actually been was afraid to stay with the weight of what difficult decisions cost. She thought about Phoebe's face at the intersection on Clark Street, the way she'd been frozen, the way she hadn't moved, and how the car had been so close, and how if Nathan had not been in that park, if he had been anywhere else, if she had never read that folder and let him leave without the pause he needed, there would have been a different ending on that street. She did not think it was fate. She didn't have much patience for that kind of scaffolding. But she thought that sometimes the consequences of the things you do lived in, places you couldn't see from your desk on the 32nd floor. That the world was much more connective than the spreadsheet could measure. Her phone buzzed. A message from Phoebe, who had gotten a phone for her birthday in January and used it primarily to send pictures of things she found interesting. The message was a photograph. It took Sylvia a moment to recognize it. The bookshop window on Commercial Drive, the one Phoebe had looked at while Nathan and Sylvia sat on the bench in the rain. The model train set was gone, replaced with something new for the season. But the stuffed owl was still there. Still there, Phoebe had written underneath it, "Thought you would want to know." Sylvia looked at the photograph for a long time. Then she typed back, "I did want to know, thank you." She put the phone down. Through the window, Vancouver was doing what Vancouver did in early spring. Indifferent rain, water on glass, the mountains invisible behind the clouds, the city going about its business. She watched it for a moment. She let herself watch it without moving on. Then she opened the Whitmore acquisition files and got back to work, and this time the difference was small but real. She stayed with the difficult numbers a little longer before she decided what they meant.